radi, že ste sa vrátili aj po krátkej obednej pauze a rovnako ma teší, že vás je tu viac. O čom budeme hovoriť, vám poviem už o chvíľu. Na úvod iba krátka rekapitulácia toho, kde sa nachádzate. Toto je 3. ročník najprestížnejšej akcie na Slovensku tohto zamerania, najväčšia technologická konferencia s názvom Slovakia, takto dúfam, že to nikomu neprekáža, Slovakia Tech Forum 2021, ešte kým dostane slovo Mr. Andrew Keen, hello, tak mi dovolte ešte povedať len zo pár takých technických informácií, ako napríklad o vzduchotechniku, kto sa tu dnes celý deň a celé dvojdnie stará. Je to firma Ruvirex, vďaka nej nikto neochorie na COVID. Predstavte si, že aj takéto veci sa dejú, sme tu v absolútnom bezpečí. A rovnako dávam do pozornosti aplikáciu s názvom Slovakia Tech, pretože na nej uvidíte menoslov speakerov, ktorí dnes ešte vystúpia a ktorí budú vystupovať zajtra. A nahliadnete tam na kompletný program, ktorý nás čaká ešte dnes po obede a potom zajtra od ranných hodín. A čo som ešte zabudol? To si hneď vyskúšajte, vďaka tej aplikácii môžete klasť našim hosťom otázky, to je veľmi dôležité. A to je asi z tých technických záležitostí všetko. Budeme sa venovať téme Human Evolution, to znamená napríklad otázkam, kam nás môže dostať evolúcia v zdravotníctve. Veľmi dôležité aj počas pandémie. Telemedicína, je to riešenie pre nákladovo efektívnejšie zdravotníctvo? Alebo ako nám dokáže analýza DNA poradiť v starostlivosti o svoje zdravie? To všetko nás čaká teraz popoludní. Ako som predznamenal, Andrew Keen sa síce nemohol zúčastniť medzi nami osobne, to nás mrzí, ale aspoň takouto formou vďaka technológiám môžeme byť spolu. A ak by náhodou niekto nepoznal nášho rečníka, o čom teda pochybujem, ale teda Andrew Keen je jedným z najznámejších a zároveň najkontroverznejších komentátorov digitálnej revolúcie na svete. Napísal 5 kníh vrátane najpredávanejšieho kultu amatéra, Internet nie je odpoveďou, či Ako opraviť budúcnosť, a práve tejto téme sa budeme venovať. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andrew Keen.
Thank you very much. I understood some of that. You can all hear me, is that correct? Everyone hear me? All right?
Yeah.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually. I apologize for not being in person, as most of you can imagine. There are reasons for me not being able to come this year, but maybe another time. I'm a big... I've never been to Kosic, but I have spent some time in Bratislava, so I'm a big fan of Slovakia. So I hope you're all having fun, and I wish I was with you. The title of my speech today, I'll speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, is How to Fix the Future. It was also the title of my last book, which came out a couple of years ago. This term, how to fix the future, of course, implies that the future is broken, that the future doesn't work anymore. My favorite phrase about the future was made by my friend Jaron Lanier. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. Like me, he has become a critic, a skeptic of the technological revolution. He was the guy, he's a neighbor of mine in San Francisco, or he was a neighbor of mine. I used to live in Berkeley, now I live in San Francisco. But he's an old friend. I'm a great admirer of him. And he once wrote, and he has also said this several times to me, that he misses the future. He's nostalgic for the future. We all used to believe in the future. Some of you, no doubt, still do. Some of you are probably entrepreneurs. You have to believe in the future. That's your business. Others of you are younger, perhaps more innocent, more idealistic, more optimistic, so you continue to believe in the future. But in Silicon Valley and in America, I think more and more people have lost faith in the future. They think it's broken. Now, of course, lots of things about the future have nothing to do with tech, or if they do have to do with tech, it's a broader conversation. I'm not going to talk today about the technology associated with global warming. I'm not going to talk about the environmental catastrophe that faces us. That, of course, is our future as well. It is, in some ways, I think, connected with the digital revolution, at least in, shall we say, spiritual or the absence of spiritual terms. But I think the digital revolution is sufficient for us to talk about today. And of course, there are many other reasons why we, or many of us, no longer believe in the future. Alongside the environmental, there's also the political and the economic. We have a crisis of democracy in the West. Slovakia, I think, is one of the few countries where we can still remain relatively optimistic about democracy, or at least that's my understanding. Maybe things have changed recently. But I know your recent administration's actually doing a good job. Unfortunately, around the world, around the world, there is a crisis of democracy, a crisis of politics. And of course, there's also a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of increasing inequality, and the looming threat of joblessness. Tying all these things together, particularly the political and the economic, is the digital crisis. The failure, in my view, of the digital revolution. I used to believe in the future. I came to the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid-90s, and I did a startup of my own, like so many people who happened to find themselves in San Francisco in the middle of the 90s. The internet seemed to be the answer. Of course, I wrote a book later called The Internet is Not the Answer. But in the mid-90s, the internet did indeed seem to be the answer. It was the answer to somebody like me whose life was lacking any kind of structure. So I threw myself into the digital revolution. It was a very exciting time. But it was also the answer, I think, in many other ways. We, and I speak of we, I mean, I can only really speak of myself, but the zeitgeist in San Francisco in the mid-90s, which I think continued for a while and maybe still exists in some pockets of technological utopians. The zeitgeist was that all this new technology, this digital technology, the internet, connectivity, these devices, this was of course pre-iPhone, pre-iWatch. This is when we still had desktops and bulky laptops. But what seemed to be exciting about the digital revolution in the mid-90s, as it became a reality, as more and more people came online, as more and more money flooded in to the ecosystem, as we had first generation internet companies like eBay and Amazon and Yahoo. What seemed possible and attractive, the seductive thing about what was happening, was it seemed to be giving us humans the A word. I use this word a lot, agency, agency. Agency means that it empowers us to control our own lives, to manage our lives. It makes us more powerful. Agency then, in my view, is or was and is and will always be a good thing for human beings. I think we need to distinguish perhaps agency from convenience. Technology isn't just about convenience. Of course, it's very nice that the click of a button, we can order something and a day or two later, that thing arrives in the post. Of course, it's very nice that we can send emails and text messages and Zoom each other as we're doing now. It's convenient, it's fun. But agency is something a little bit more profound, a little bit more philosophical. It empowers us. It equips us. To use perhaps a military metaphor, it arms us. It arms us to fight, not other people or the world, but to manage our lives, to control our lives, to shape our lives, to architect our lives. That notion of shaping one's life, I think, is very much of a Central European concept. Some of you will be very familiar with it in philosophical or cultural terms from your great writers and philosophers and historians. It's also a thing that's manifested in political terms. The notion of agency was one that was very attractive and remains attractive in political terms. It was born in the 19th century, the cultural agency of nationalism, of the Czech and the Slovakian peoples freeing themselves from the old empires, freeing themselves from the Habsburg Empire. And then 100 years later, perhaps Slovakia freeing itself from Czechoslovakia. Agency means controlling one's own life, managing one's own life, whether it's economic or political or cultural. And that's why I was attracted to the internet. Like everybody else, of course, it was fun, it was exciting, and I was seduced by the idea of enormous wealth, which never came true. But I think the most compelling, the most seductive, and the longest lasting sales technique, if you like, of the digital revolution was providing us agency. Now, that's where I think the future has failed. That's where it's broken. Rather than providing us agency, the digital revolution has actually done the reverse. In many ways, the digital revolution has enslaved us. It's enslaved us not just to the technology, which we all depend on, that is essential to our lives, but it's enslaved us to the companies and, if you like, the ideologies of the digital revolution. Let me talk a little bit. Let me check on the time, and I've got 50 minutes here. Let me talk a little bit about the kind of agency I think that we've lost with the digital revolution. I'll try and connect it with the books I've written. And then, because this speech is called How to Fix the Future, I do want to get on to fixes. I want to get on to solutions, because in our age where the zeitgeist has shifted from optimism to pessimism about technology, in our age where more and more people bash big tech, and particularly the big tech of Silicon Valley, it's all too easy to be critical. And the great challenge today, it's easy to be critical. Everybody knows the critique. The challenge is actually fixing it. The challenge is coming up with solutions. So let me talk about 3 or 4 areas of agency, which I think are really important, which I think has failed to be realized. The first is information. We were told, I'm not sure if anyone quite put it in these terms, but information, free information in particular, the kind of ideology of free information articulated by boosters, early boosters of the digital revolution, like Larry Lessig and Chris Anderson. Many of you will know these names. Some of you will have read their books. It's the idea that information will liberate us. We'll be able to manage our lives because we'll have access to all the information in the world. These devices, which of course we all have, were supposed to become libraries where we would become wise. The more wisdom we have, the more agency we have over our own lives. The more wisdom we have, the more understanding we have of the world. The more information we have, the more we can master the environment around us. Information then was supposed to be empowering. It was taken for granted that as the digital revolution resulted in this universal library where everything was accessible, where information was increasingly free and so easy to access, we would realize ourselves in a very profound way. This is not, of course, a new idea. Karl Marx, writing in the 19th century in the German ideology, suggested that post-capitalist technology would free us, would liberate us. You people in Central Europe, of course, know the reality of that in the way it worked out. The digital revolution has had, though, I think, an ironic and in some ways a rather tragic story in terms of information. Now, let me say up front, of course, there is some truth to the idea of the digital revolution providing us information, which in turn produces agency. I couldn't do my job as a writer, as a commentator, as a podcaster, as a broadcaster, as a public speaker without Wikipedia. And I've been very critical of Wikipedia over the years, although I think I'm much less critical today. The internet remains a remarkable resource if you know your way around. The internet is freeing, it's liberating, and it is a much more convenient and accessible way of getting information than a library or a bookstore or anything like that. But it became increasingly clear to me as I was a participant and an entrepreneur, an observer, a commentator of the digital revolution, that after Web 2.0, which really was pioneered by Google and Google's IPO in 2001, and then the appearance of these dominant platform companies like Facebook in the early 2000s, it became increasingly clear that information wasn't liberating. Because alongside the Web 2.0 revolution, alongside technology which allowed anyone to publish anything, alongside technology which essentially made professional journalism pretty much redundant, undermining the business model of most newspapers, alongside the technology that allowed anyone to put music or video up, alongside the YouTubes and these other increasingly powerful Web 2.0 companies. We had what I called in my first book, in my 2007 book, The Cult of the Amateur. The idea that everyone should have an opinion and that the platform, the digital platform, should present everyone with the ability to publish anything they wanted. What we had then in the Web 2.0 revolution were the seeds of the kind of chaos, the epistemological chaos, which I think is increasingly undermining democracy around the world and turning all of us into relativists, turning everyone, turning information or the information ecosystem into something profoundly chaotic. You see it in Europe with the vaccine skeptics. You see it with a more and more conspiratorial internet. The reality of the Web 2.0 revolution was, rather than providing us agency, which, as I've suggested, it did to some extent, it's created a world where no one believes anything that anyone said. It's created epistemological uncertainty. It means that trust has become the great victim of the digital revolution. And indeed, when anyone does any of these trust surveys online or offline, we find that we're losing more and more faith in our institutions. So the consequence of the Web 2.0 revolution, which I wrote about in this book, Cult of the Amateur, suggests that the amateur has replaced the professional. We no longer believe professional journalists or professors. The expert has become the victim of the digital revolution. And when we lose expertise, when we lose the idea that someone who professionally spends their life collecting information and organizing information is no more or less reliable than anyone else, then we have, as I said, epistemological chaos. Then no one knows what to believe. And in my view, agency, human agency, the ability to control or manage our lives is a victim. That, I think, accounts for the great deal of the sense of powerlessness that many of us have today. The idea that we can't control our world, this challenge to the Enlightenment, this challenge to the notion of science being the answer, of science being the thing that we can rely on, has indeed been undermined by the Web 2.0 revolution. So agency is a victim here, the most profound kind of agency, an agency which implies that we can master our universe, that idea of mastering our universe and mastering our own lives is a modern phenomenon. It only came about in the post Middle Ages. It only came about in the modern age with the Enlightenment. And the internet, ironically enough, in spite of its ability to centralize information and provide free information and all the rest of it, hasn't done that. The second area I wrote about in my book, Digital Vertigo, which came out in 2011. This book is a remix, a conscious remix of Hitchcock's movie, Vertigo, his 1958 movie, a story about a man who falls in love with a woman who didn't really exist. And I think that is what has happened with social media. We were told that transparency would provide us agency. Transparency would free us. Transparency would ennoble us. The social was supposed to be the thing that would revolutionize the world. This was most clearly articulated by Mark Zuckerberg, but it was a feature of all social media theorists, from the founders of Twitter to YouTube to everyone else. Zuckerberg somehow packaged it most successfully, and of course, Facebook has been the most powerful company. The problem, of course, with the arguments that Zuckerberg made, and this comes out of the digital of the Web 2.0 revolution, is it was a lie. The problem with the digital, with the social media ideology of people like Zuckerberg, was it forgot to remind us that we have been packaged up as the product. Shoshana Zuboff has written a brilliant book on this called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. My book, Digital Vertigo, is not in the same class, but it touched on many of the themes, and it was written a little earlier than Zuboff's book. Surveillance capitalism is the economic system which is being brought into being by the digital revolution. A system where, quote unquote, free Web 2.0 companies like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter amass our information, give us the product for free, and then turn us into the product, where we're being watched every day more and more. Many people have written critiques of this. Perhaps the best one is by the Bay Area fiction writer Dave Eggers, whose 2013 book, The Circle, has been also made into a television series. Surveillance weakens us. We have created the architecture, the masters of the universe, or the new masters of our universe, have created a digital universe where we're being watched all the time, where we are the products. And this is deeply hostile to the idea of agency. It means that we lose our agency to the watchers, that we are being watched, that our lives, our inner lives, our private lives are being destroyed. There was, of course, that very famous East German film, The Lives of Others, which was a movie about exposing the evils of the Stasi, the surveillance nature of the East German Stasi regime. But ironically enough, what the Silicon Valley big tech companies have done is architected a panopticon-like economy, which in many ways is simply more efficient, more ubiquitous, and cleverer than the inefficiency, the rather pathetic political economy that the Stasi created. So surveillance has undermined, surveillance and information have undermined our idea of agency. In 2015, I wrote a book called The Internet is Not the Answer. And let me mention a couple of other areas where I think we lose our sense of agency. We were promised in the digital revolution that this new flat playing field, this disruptive economy, would empower small entrepreneurs. Everyone had the chance to become the next Zuckerberg, the next Larry Page, the next Steve Jobs. the next Jeff Bezos. But of course, there's only ever one Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. The reality of the digital revolution is it's a winner-take-all economy. That's nobody's fault. It's not because Bezos or Zuckerberg are any more immoral than any other entrepreneur. All entrepreneurs, as Peter Thiel reminds us, want to become monopolists. That's what being an entrepreneur is. You want to control your own market. It's natural. There's nothing wrong with that. But the beauty of most economic systems is they don't lend themselves to monopolies. The beauty of most economic systems is everyone has a chance. The problem with the digital economy is it lends itself to winners. It's a winner-take-all economy. Many people have written books about this, and this was a pre-digital phenomenon too. It happened with Microsoft in desktop publishing. Only now with the Web 2.0 revolution, it's more and more pronounced. We see it with Amazon, of course, a $2 or $3 trillion company, which increasingly dominates all aspects of not only of the e-commerce space, but of many other areas also. These new companies are post-industrial capitalist companies. They're not just dominant in one area, as Exxon is dominating in oil. A company like Amazon dominates in e-commerce, but dominates in web services, dominates in healthcare. These companies are remarkably powerful. Now, I think the 4 or 5 most highly capitalized companies in the world are all digital companies, whether it's Apple or Amazon or Google or Facebook. So the winner-take-all economy means that it's harder and harder to compete. What we have then is an architecture of capitalism, which is controlled by a tiny group of increasingly powerful and wealthy companies, multi-trillion-dollar companies, which would have been unimaginable in the mid-90s. Even today, companies like Facebook and Google present themselves as plucky companies disrupting the economy. But of course, that's not true. These are the new Exxon Mobiles, the new monopolistic banking companies or railroad companies of the 21st century. Once again, then they've undermined agency. Now, Bezos has agency, he can do whatever he likes. He's a trillionaire, or wherever he is, he will eventually become a trillionaire. The same is true of Elon Musk. They have their own agency of conquering, of colonizing space, but the rest of us don't. What this winner-take-all economy has done is also compounded the dramatic inequality in wealth. You have men like Bezos worth hundreds of billions of dollars, Musk worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And the gulf between them and everybody else is increasingly daunting and troubling. And that kind of inequality, of course, undermines agency too. It's really important to bear this in mind. It's too easy to be moral, and it's too easy to sort of label these people as evil. I don't think they are. I don't think Bezos is any more evil, or certainly than Bill Gates, or any other successful capitalist in history. It's just that the architecture of the digital economy lends itself to winners. And this is the thing which has undermined our agency. It's very, very difficult. Many of you may be entrepreneurs. It's increasingly difficult to break into this economy now. Finally, there's the issue of jobs. We were told that this technology would provide labor for all of us, that this would be the new thing, that it would change the nature of industrial society. Now, of course, it's created many jobs. Many of you maybe, I'm sure most of you are actually employed in digital companies one way or the other, as programmers, as entrepreneurs, as marketing people. So these jobs have been created. But there is something deeply troubling on the horizon, which is the ultimate foe of agency, which is artificial intelligence. Now, we all know that the idea of artificial intelligence has become so ubiquitous that it's really essentially the future of technology. All technology is smart. All technology is AI. And the idea of there being AI in the future is a kind of is a contradiction in terms, because all technology in the future will be AI. But the reality of agency and AI is very, very troubling, because the technology that we've invented with the digital revolution will eventually replace many, many jobs. It's already seeing it with self-driving cars, already seeing it with programming, already seeing it with smart technologies replacing lawyers and doctors and engineers. And we're still in the early stages of this. This technology means that we won't have labor. Now, there will be new jobs, of course. We know there'll be new jobs, but more and more economists are worried with the numbers of jobs that will exist. There'll be some, and again, there'll be jobs that will pay a great deal of money. There are always going to be top lawyers, top doctors, top engineers, top programmers. But what we're losing in this winner-take-all economy is the middle. And we're already seeing the early stages of this profound shift in the labor market, where you have a huge underclass, a precariat of people in the so-called sharing economy, driving Uber cars, doing tasks for people, a wealthy class, and not much in between. So the issue of labor, the issue of inequality, the winner-take-all economy, the issue of innovation, the issue of information, and the issue of surveillance. These are the things that I think in very, very broad terms are undermining our agency. And I could speak more about that, but I want to get on to the fixes. Let me also mention that the two technologies on the horizon are particularly troubling. I didn't look at your schedule, but I'm sure you've had a lot of talks about crypto. And I'm sure a lot of the people speaking about crypto are articulating the potential of the revolution in a similar language to the one we heard in the late 90s about Web 2.0, that it would free us, that it would level the playing field, that we would challenge the old banking system, that it would empower the impoverished because now they will have money, that this disruption would be a good thing. Some of that is true. There's no doubt that the old banking system is pretty rotten and archaic. The same is true of the old education system or the old political system. All these industrial systems need replacing. But the problem is that the replacement being made, when it came to the information system with Google, when it came to the e-commerce system with Amazon, when it came to the social system with Facebook, when it came to the hardware system with Apple, is no better than before, more and more unequal. So don't believe in crypto. I would be very skeptical indeed of crypto, especially since it seemed to me to be very much a bubble. And when it comes to AI, I'm particularly troubled by these so-called platforms. One of Silicon Valley's most successful young man, somebody called Sam Altman, who used to who's very well known. Some of you may know him. He's very smart. He is the CEO of a new company called OpenAI, which is promising to give everyone AI, but is increasingly seen as a platform which is privatizing intelligence and again, compounding the inequalities. So the issues in the future, whether it's crypto, whether it's AI, whether it's self-driving cars, whether it's all these new revolutions, whether indeed it's biotech, all the things that I've talked about when it comes to surveillance or inequality or jobs or a winner-take-all economy are more and more self-evident. These are enormously important issues then. They're going to shape the future. They mean that they will shape the entire history, not just perhaps of the 21st century, but of the 22nd and 23rd century, because these technologies aren't going to go away. They're becoming more intense. Moore's law isn't going away. And what we're seeing is every market, from finance to education to politics to healthcare, all being radically revolutionized. So what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? Now, let me say that nothing ever really gets fixed, because every new fix creates new problems. So I don't want to present some sort of utopia. I don't want to suggest that I have a solution, an idea that will fix all this. That's often the problem of technological determinism or what some people call solutionism, the idea that we can always come up with these absolute fixes. No fix is absolute. The nature of human history is always marked by failure and by invention and reinvention. But there are ways, I think, that we can fix this stuff or begin to address them. And let's remind ourselves of the meta issue that needs to be fixed. The meta issue is agency. We need to give back agency. We need this technology to empower us. As I said in the first part of my speech, it hasn't empowered us. It's turned us into products. We're less and less powerful because of economic inequality. Our jobs are more and more precarious. Indeed, we are increasingly part of what economists call a precariat. We're less and less well-informed. We're less trusting of institutions. We feel more and more powerless in an information, in the chaos of our information, our social media information system. So what are we going to do about it? We need to fix agency. We need to give ourselves back power. And in my book, How to Fix the Future, which I hope some of you have a chance to read, it's a couple of years old, but I think it's as relevant today as it was when I wrote it. And some of the examples are a bit out of date, but the themes are as relevant as ever. The first thing I think we need is to recognize the importance of regulation. Now, it's important to note that regulation in itself is not sufficient. But what we've seen over the last few years are regulators beginning to recognize that unless big tech is controlled, big tech will control us. For my book, How to Fix the Future, I spent a little time with a Danish politician called Margrethe Vestager in Brussels. When I wrote the book, she wasn't that well known. Today, of course, she's almost a household name around the world. As the first person, a woman, perhaps not uncoincidentally, to take on big tech. The EU has led the way in focusing on monopolies, on surveillance, on the injustices of the digital economy. And I think that Vestager is our model. But increasingly in America, we're seeing regulators take on big tech. There's a woman called Lina Khan, who is the new head of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, who is now doing an increasingly good job in recognizing that we need to rethink monopolies. Regulation is really important. Now, there'll be some of you in the audience who don't like to hear this. Some of you are libertarians. Some of you are hostile to government. Some of you simply think that government is too slow and inefficient to ever deal or to take on technology. I disagree. Government is, I don't idealize government, and I know in Central Europe you have your own history of inefficient and unjust bureaucracies and authoritarian regimes. But government's all we have, really, in terms of taking these big companies on. Either it's the companies or the government. There isn't really much in between. And I think characters, politicians like Vestager and Khan are really important if big tech is to be tamed, if it's going to be managed, if we are able to seize back agency. But regulators aren't sufficient. We also need entrepreneurs. Some of you, I hope in the audience, are entrepreneurs. Some of you will have startups. I think the first wave or the first two waves of internet entrepreneurs made a lot of mistakes. The Web 1.0 entrepreneurs like myself, we had no idea what we were doing. We had no reference points. It was a beautiful chaos. It was a lot of fun. But most of our companies didn't succeed. One or two did, like Bezos's Amazon, and I guess Jerry Yang's Yahoo. But most of the Web 1.0 companies weren't that relevant. The Web 2.0, the Web 2.0 entrepreneurs companies are much more relevant, whether it's Google or Facebook or YouTube or many other companies. And their ideology, I think, has turned out to be very often self-serving and fraudulent. I think Zuckerberg is the model of the failed entrepreneur, not in economic terms, but in moral terms. Zuckerberg lies. Zuckerberg clearly has no real moral credibility. He's lost it. Maybe he believed in social media at one point. Maybe he believed in the idea that we could all become free by being more transparent. But ultimately, he hasn't thought this stuff through. And now when he shows up or when he articulates his vision for Facebook, it clearly benefits Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but nobody else. We need a new breed of entrepreneurs. We need entrepreneurs who aren't just public interest. We're not talking about social entrepreneurs, because I think social entrepreneurship is, in many ways, not the solution. But we need entrepreneurs to be more morally responsible. We need accountability with a new generation of entrepreneurs. They need to understand what they're doing. So, for example, with crypto or AI, if you have a crypto or an AI company, you need to be accountable. You need to be honest about what you're doing and what you're trying to do. You can't rip off the world as the Web 2.0 companies did with surveillance capitalism. You can't tell lies. You can't just continue to mislead people. So I think there's a need for a new accountable class of entrepreneurs. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't want to make money, but efficiency and success can and a decency can go together. And we're seeing, I think, a new breed of entrepreneurs, and we're also seeing a new culture, even in Silicon Valley, of more responsible people coming out of irresponsible companies like Apple and Google, and above all else, Facebook. People recognize, I think, technologists, programmers, marketers, salespeople, recognize the damage that this technology has done. It's all around us: the crisis of democracy, the inequality, surveillance, insecurity, ignorance, paranoia. All these things are bound up, I think, in the failure of the digital revolution. So we need a more responsible entrepreneurial class, but citizens also need to take responsibility too. It's not enough just to rely on politicians. It's not enough just to rely on entrepreneurs. We all have a responsibility, whether we're parents or teachers, whether we're friends. One of the other consequences of the digital revolution, which I haven't even talked about yet, which you're all too familiar with, is the fact that this technology, which we all live and die with, is addictive. It is the new fast food. It is the new cocaine. It is the new tobacco. And indeed, the industry surrounding it is the new tobacco, alcohol industry. So we need to recognize that we consumers are responsible and accountable too. Just as we fought back against some of the excesses of capitalism, just as we fought back against the injustices of the capitalist system, we need to take responsibility too. We also need, there are 5 pillars, if you like, of fixing the future. We also need unions, labor unions, professional unions. We need groups of people to work in political terms. This is a multifaceted effort. It's not going to come just through Margaret Vestager or Margaret Vestager or Lena Khan. It's not just going to come with a new Mark Zuckerberg who's more moral. It's not just going to come if we can master the addictive nature of our cell phones and of gaming and of social media. It's going to come with the action of labor unions and other organizations which take responsibility for shaping the future. For us to control the future, we have to control the future. It's catch-22. It's chicken and egg. It's one of the ironies of history. To master history, we have to master history. To master technology, we have to master technology. But we do it through organizations. We've done it in the past and we'll do it in the future. We did it with the Industrial Revolution and we can do it again. Finally, education is very important. Now, all too often education is left to the end of these discussions. It's the catch-all, it's the cure-all. And I often joke, it's not a very funny joke, but we always leave everything to the teachers because it suggests we don't really have a cure and we assume that teachers can fix everything. And of course, in America and in many other countries, teachers are poorly paid, the education system is underfunded. But ultimately, education is key. We need to teach young people, and perhaps not so young people, about the reality of this through events like this, through books, through classes. So education is the fifth pillar in fixing the future. This thing won't come quickly. It's not something that will magically appear. It's not as if we're going to wake up in 2022 or 2025 with the fix to this. These are ongoing problems. And as technology becomes more innovative, as AI becomes ubiquitous, as we have crypto, as we have new technologies disrupting every industry in the world, these challenges are only going to become more paramount and more pertinent. But we have to get our act together today. When we think in 2021, in September 21, of how different the world is from the world that I began digital in the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, we believed in technology. We believed in the future. Now, we don't believe in the future. Most of us don't. We're fearful of the future. We're fearful of monopolies. We're fearful of the addictive quality of technology. We're fearful of inequality. We're fearful that this technology will take away the all too human nature of work. All these things are realities. It's not because we're paranoid. It's not because we're hostile to technology. We've got to address these things now. We've got to do it politically and economically. We've got to do it through regulators, through entrepreneurs, through teachers, through citizens, through union groups. If we work together, it can be done. We've done it in the past. We did it with the Industrial Revolution. I came to Slovakia a couple of years ago, actually before COVID, and I know that Slovakia is one of the parts of Central Europe which is the earliest manifestation of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, you had equally dramatic inequality and alienation from labor and labor unrest and anger and uncertainty. Now, we never conquered it completely, and we still have the massive existential crisis of global warming. But some aspects of the Industrial Revolution have been fixed. We got unions, we got protection from monopolies, we got a more responsible class of entrepreneurs. So it can be done. We need to do it now. Unless we start now, we're going to lose this thing. So I hope some of you will listen to this. Some of you will begin to fix the future, because if we don't do it now, then the future will never be fixed. So thank you so much. I hope you will have a great day. And it's always hard to give these speeches. I have no idea whether any of you are even listening, but I hope this has resonated in some way. So thank you very much.
Mr. Andrew Keen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Technológie spôsobujú závislosť, aj to povedal vo svojom príhovore Andrew Keen. Aká nás teda čaká budúcnosť, to máme v rukách každý z nás. Aj prezident Slovakia, Juraj Miškov, už v lani povedal, technológie môžu byť našim skvelým pomocníkom, ak nájdeme spôsob, ako ich ovládať bez toho, aby oni ovládali naše životy. Však Juraj, čiže treba s mierou všetko, a najmä v čase pandémie, hoaxov a tak ďalej.